Today, let's talk about some supernatural stories that have been passed down around the foot of Mount Tai. My hometown is a small village near Mount Tai, nestled in a small valley between two hills. Although it's somewhat remote, it's not completely isolated. There's a county road and long-distance buses passing through. However, since the road only leads to a few villages inside, traffic is sparse. In the 1990s, the wave of migrant workers took away most of the young people, and now the village is almost deserted. The land was never fertile, and farming couldn't sustain a family, so the remaining young people eventually left. Now, less than one-tenth of the population remains, mostly elderly people, whose children either couldn't or wouldn't take them to the city. Many houses are dilapidated, and large areas have become wasteland. The stories I'm about to tell come from this village and a few similar ones nearby. Some are my own experiences, while others were encountered by my childhood friends. I left in 1995 when I was almost 10 years old, so most of these stories are still clear in my memory. The slanted path is a small trail leading from the village to the eastern ridge. It's called slanted, not because of its incline, but because the sides of the path slope slightly. In the past, many people pushing carts would often end up in the roadside ditches. In the 1980s, a larger dirt road was built on the eastern ridge, and the slanted path fell into disuse. As a child, I wouldn't have known about this path if it weren't for the adults mentioning it. However, the path was also known as the evil path, as many people had encountered strange things on it, including me. When I was young, I went with some village friends to play at the reservoir on the eastern ridge. As evening approached, the sky turned gray, and it looked like rain was coming. We hurried back, and not far along the way, one of the kids said, "Look, is there a path here?" We looked and saw that, although overgrown with weeds, it was indeed a path, though it seemed rarely used. An older kid said he had taken this path before, and it was a shortcut back to the village. We decided to take it. This path was the evil path. At first, nothing seemed unusual. We walked and joked, but soon the older kid noticed something was wrong. The village was supposed to be at the foot of the ridge, visible from a higher point and not far away. But after walking for a while, not only had we not reached the village, but we couldn't even see it anymore. All around us were wild, uninhabited hills. To make matters worse, it was getting dark, and a light rain had started. One of the kids got scared. We were familiar with this area, but we had never heard of this place. We played everywhere, so how could we have missed such a large area? We stopped walking and started shouting, but there was no response. The older kid suggested we turn back and try to find our way. We agreed and ran back as fast as we could. After what felt like forever, we finally saw the reservoir where we had been playing. Looking back, the village was just below the slanted path. At that moment, an elderly villager passed by and called out, "What are you doing? Go home." We felt like we had been saved and quickly followed him back to the village on the main road. On the way, we asked the old man about the path. He frowned and said, "Don't ask, just don't go there again." Last year, when I returned to my hometown, I suddenly remembered this path and went to look for it. I finally found it, but it was completely overgrown, clearly no longer in use. Out of curiosity, I walked it again, but this time I reached the village without any strange occurrences. Where we had gone that day remains a mystery. The village is said to have been established during the Ming Dynasty, and the first settler was surnamed Shu. For many years, the Shu family was the dominant clan in the village. According to my grandfather, after the founding of the People's Republic, the Shu family's lineage suddenly began to decline. By the 1980s, the only male descendant left was Shu Laoer. His older brother, Shu Lao Da, had died young, leaving Shu Laoer as the sole heir. However, Shu Laoer remained a bachelor, not because he was a bad person, but because he had a limp. Although he could walk, his disability made it hard for him to find a wife, and he remained single until he was 40. One day, Shu Laoer was working in the fields with some friends when his hoe hit something hard. Thinking it was a rock, he tried to dig it out. After a few attempts, he realized it wasn't a rock but a large stone slab. His friends came over to help, and when they unearthed it, they were shocked. It was a tombstone, the tombstone of the Shu family's ancestor. However, no coffin was found. The villagers quickly mobilized to help Shu Laoer rebuild the ancestral grave to honor the village's founder. But from that day on, Shu Laoer began acting strangely, often saying things like, "The ancestors are calling me back." 2 months later, he died peacefully in his sleep at home. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but many villagers couldn't help but connect it to the ancestral grave. Some elders said the Shu family's ancestor couldn't bear to see Shu Laoer suffer in this world and had taken him away. Granny Zhao was an ordinary elderly woman who passed away in the early 1990s. I don't know the exact year, as Granny Zhao never married and had no descendants. In her later years, she relied on raising a few goats and support from relatives. Because she was always kind and helpful, everyone in the village respectfully called her Granny. Whenever there was a dispute in the village, she was the one to mediate. Granny Zhao had always been strong and healthy, likely due to a lifetime of hard work. However, the period leading up to her death was quite eerie. First, she said she kept dreaming of her parents and that her time was near. Many people nearing the end of their lives have such dreams. Then, in the nights before her death, there were often sobbing sounds in her house. 2 white candles were lit at her door, and the yard was filled with traces of burnt paper, as if someone had already died. The neighbors thought it was unlucky and advised her not to dwell on such thoughts. But Granny Zhao insisted that her time was truly near, saying she had tried to buy more life but failed. The paper wouldn't burn completely. The candles wouldn't stay lit, and the incense she lit didn't burn properly. The villagers dismissed it as the superstitions of an old woman and didn't take it seriously. Granny Zhao didn't die at night but during the day. She wasn't in bed but sitting upright in the only decent chair in her house, her head tilted back. It was as if she had known the exact time of her death and had prepared for it. It was autumn, with leaves falling and a cold north wind blowing. The scene, combined with the candles at the door and Granny Zhao's posture, was terrifying. The first to discover her was her younger sister, who often visited to chat. That day she had made dumplings and brought them over at noon, only to find this chilling scene. After Granny Zhao was buried, no one dared to live in her house, and it remained empty. Does a person know when their time is near? Disappearances happen everywhere. People get lost, kidnapped, or meet with accidents. But the disappearance in the neighboring village was different. This incident happened long ago, and some elders still shudder when they mention it. It occurred in the village closest to ours, around the 1960s, during the era of collective farming. Not far from the village, on a ridge, there was an old dilapidated temple. Because it was close to the fields, people would take shelter there when it rained. It was said that the Buddha statue inside had long been destroyed, leaving only an empty room with some straw mats. The windows and doors were broken, and the temple offered little shelter from the wind. Yet this very temple later became a place people feared to enter. Here's what happened. One day, a heavy storm was brewing, with dark clouds and thunder. The brigade leader suggested everyone return to the village to take shelter. Everyone left except for one man, surnamed Lu, known as Laoer. He had gone to the restroom and returned to find the group already far ahead. As he hurried to catch up, it started to rain and he took shelter in the temple. Someone at the back of the group saw him enter but thought nothing of it, as everyone was rushing back to the village. That evening, Lauer's wife went to the brigade leader, saying her husband hadn't returned and was missing. The brigade leader organized a search. The person who had seen Lauer enter the temple suggested he might have fallen asleep inside. The group went to the temple with flashlights but found only Lauer's shoes. The brigade leader was baffled. How could someone leave without their shoes? They searched the area but found no trace of him. The search continued for days, and the police were notified, but Lauer had vanished without a trace. In the 1980s, the Liu family built a grave for him and buried his clothes. Strangely, the temple collapsed in the 1980s. While clearing the debris, villagers found a stone slab beneath the temple, and under it, a buried Buddha statue. This story was told to me by a friend a long time ago, and I'm not sure if it's true. My friend's name is Bien Hua. When he was in high school, the road home was quite long, and after evening self-study, he had to walk through a narrow path to get home. The path was lined with trees, and honestly, it wasn't very safe. But back then, there were fewer bad people, and nothing unusual ever happened. The school didn't require students to live on campus, and Bien Hua preferred the quiet, so he went home every day. Over time, he got used to walking the night road. But some things happen when you least expect them. To this day, Bien Hua insists he must have seen a ghost. That night, he was walking home as usual when he noticed something strange. There was a shadow in front of him, but it wasn't cast by the moonlight. He quickly turned around and saw a beam of light not far away, as if someone was walking with a flashlight. Bien Hua didn't think much of it, since many people used that road, and he continued walking. Walking on a dirt road at night can be tricky when there's a light shining from afar. Both the shadow and the light can blur the path, making it harder to see than when only the moon is lighting the way. Bien Hua had trouble seeing the road and quickened his pace. After a while, the light behind him dimmed. Suddenly, another beam of light appeared, this time from ahead. It was not only blinding, but also made the road even harder to see. Bien Hua cursed under his breath, annoyed by the flashlight, and stopped to let the person pass. But after a while, the light didn't move. It just stayed there. Feeling irritated, Bien Hua decided to confront the person. Just then, the light went out. Bien Hua was momentarily disoriented, surrounded by complete darkness. After about 10 seconds, his eyes adjusted, and he realized the person in front of him was gone. Being a perceptive person, Bien Hua felt something was off and decided to hurry home. As he was about to start walking, the light reappeared, this time behind him, but the light wasn't shining on him anymore. Bien Hua looked toward the light and felt a chill in his heart. The light source was floating. There was no person holding it. Moreover, the light wasn't the usual yellow but a reddish hue. It wasn't a flashlight at all. Bien Hua was terrified and ran home in a panic. After that, he refused to walk that road again and chose to live on campus. The Eastern Ridge was the place where the most strange occurrences happened in the village. It's no wonder, as the land there was infertile and unsuitable for farming. It's said that in ancient times, it was a burial ground for the poor, and during the anti-Japanese war, it became a battlefield where thousands were buried. A few identifiable bodies were moved to the town's martyrs' cemetery, but most were buried on the spot. This incident happened when I was old enough to understand. At that time, the entire village was filled with tension. Here's what happened. First, my distant uncle was working on the Eastern Ridge when he saw a person in a long gown standing in a chestnut grove, watching him from a distance. Curious, he called out, but the person didn't respond. My uncle, being older and more experienced, felt something was wrong. Why would someone be dressed in ancient clothing? He immediately ran back to the village to get help. On the way, he met another villager heading up the ridge and dragged him back to look, but the figure was gone. The villagers thought my uncle was joking and didn't take it seriously. A few days later, another villager encountered the same figure, this time in a cypress grove on the eastern ridge. This person was braver and called out several times, but when there was no response, he approached to ask. In the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. From then on, the story spread, and the village's ghostly tales grew more intense. Some villagers wanted to investigate, but the figure in the gown never appeared again. After a month, the incident gradually faded. But one day, in the small square in front of the village store where people liked to gather in the evening, the figure in the gown reappeared on the distant slope, staring straight at everyone. This time, with so many people around, they weren't as scared and decided to rush over together. Surprisingly, the figure moved this time, turning and walking behind the slope before disappearing. When the villagers reached the spot, they found nothing. Someone suggested that it might be an ancestor trying to tell them something. They dug where the figure had disappeared but found nothing. After that, the matter was dropped, and the figure in the gown never appeared again. There's a small valley in the village called Agu, Proud Bone, though I'm not sure how it's written. Agu is actually very small, only a few dozen meters long and wide. To the west is a small water inlet connected to a slope. To the east and north are steep cliffs, making it inaccessible. The only entrance is to the south, where the water flows out and you can wade in. In the 1980s, the village decided to turn the area into a fish pond and began cleaning it up. One day, the village chief took a few workers into the valley. When they returned that afternoon, the chief looked pale and kept muttering about sin. Later, it was revealed that the number of remains in the valley was staggering, layer upon layer. The chief felt he couldn't handle it and reported it to the township. The township also felt it was beyond their capability and reported it to the city. Soon, police and trucks arrived. The police determined that the remains were very old and didn't pursue any responsibility. They bagged the remains and took them to the city to be cremated. The cleanup work for the fish pond proceeded as planned. But then strange things started happening. The workers didn't dare stay in the valley and set up tents outside. At night, the foreman heard strange sounds, like tapping, as if someone was hitting stones. The foreman, being brave, went out to investigate and found that the sounds were coming from the valley. Shining a flashlight, he saw something white and smoke-like moving inside. Upon closer inspection, there was nothing there. The foreman found it odd, but didn't say anything and went back to sleep. The next night, the sounds came from the valley again. This time, almost everyone heard it. The group was so scared that they ran back to the village overnight, refusing to continue the work. Agu was left untouched and remains a forbidden area to this day. This happened after I moved to Tai'an City, near Sanyu Village and Yuan community. If you're from Tai'an, you're probably familiar with the area. I lived there for a few years, and at the time, there was always a woman selling eggs, riding a Jialing motorcycle and shouting "selling eggs" as she went door to door. If you lived nearby, you'd know who I'm talking about. Almost everyone in the area bought eggs from her. But this woman's life was incredibly tragic. Her husband died young, her eldest son drowned in Hushan Reservoir, and her younger daughter fell seriously ill after getting married. To make matters worse, the woman herself was eventually killed in a car accident. While this seems like a tragic story, a relative later told me there was more to it. The woman's husband had a plot of land in his hometown, about an acre of decent land, but in the middle of the land was a small mountain shrine, which he found inconvenient. He decided to tear it down, despite the village elders warning him not to, saying there would be consequences. He ignored them and demolished the shrine. An elderly villager, unable to bear it, built a small shed and reinstalled the shrine. Less than a year after tearing down the shrine, the man fell ill and died before he was 30, leaving behind his wife and 2 children. But the retribution didn't end there. Their eldest son at 16 had just finished his middle school exams and went swimming with friends in Hushan Reservoir. He never came back up. The egg-selling woman was so devastated that she nearly cried herself blind. Before she could recover, her daughter fell seriously ill, reportedly with kidney failure. I don't know if she received treatment or if she's still alive, because just as these tragedies piled up, the woman, muttering, "What sin have I committed?" every day, was hit by a truck and died on the spot. People still talk about this incident, warning others that even if you don't believe in such things, it's best not to offend them lightly. My grandmother passed away many years ago, and this story was told by my mother. When my mother was very young, my grandmother once had a fierce argument with my grandfather. Burdened by daily troubles, my grandmother felt driven to suicide. That day, after tidying up the house, she walked alone toward the western mountains. She was in a daze, her vision blurring, and the morning mist made her increasingly disoriented. After walking for a long time, a middle-aged man suddenly approached her and said, "Don't wander off. Look at the road clearly." My grandmother thought the man was strange and ignored him, walking around him. The man called out again, "You're going the wrong way. That's not the path." My grandmother looked carefully and realized she had indeed wandered onto a grassy slope. She found it odd. She had walked this path many times before. How could she have gone wrong? Turning around, she saw the road not far away and hurried back to it. Strangely, although she had been heading west, this path led her to her hometown, which was actually to the north. A cousin of hers came out of the village and invited her in for tea. Seeing her cousin, my grandmother poured out her grievances and cried for a long time. Meanwhile, her absence had caused chaos at home. My grandfather gathered the villagers to search for her, and they found her that evening and brought her home. Later, my grandmother told my mother about the incident, saying the man was a savior, perhaps a deity. He saw that she was walking toward death and guided her to the path of life. My grandmother didn't live past the age of 73 and passed away the same year as my grandfather.